Okay, now we'll begin to open it up for questions, and I'll call upon myself first. Mr. Lennington, I'd like to have you give us a little bit of a background of what some people call affirmative action. As I understood, it began in 1965, Lyndon Johnson, and since that time, our nation has shifted more and more in that direction. Could you let us know, kind of, first of all, I think it was supposed to be a race thing, but at what time did people from south of the border wind up getting added to the mix? At what time did women get added to the mix? And do these policies result, as a practical matter, American businesses discriminating on the part of sex, by sex or race?
I think that's a fair estimation. What I would say is that, first thing to remember is that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed in July of 1964. There was an election in November of 1964, and every single person who voted for that law was reelected. It was very popular among the American people, and one of the reasons why is because the law was itself colorblind. There's actually a provision at the end of Title VII that says that nothing in this law should be read to encourage the development of quotas or goals. But after that election, President Johnson did go in to establish this Executive Order 11246, which established affirmative action with some teeth, which meant that goals were going to be then enforced by the federal government. And so federal contractors were encouraged to set aside businesses for minorities under something called the Philadelphia Plan. That was later expanded greatly by President Nixon under his Secretary of Labor, George Shultz, and then basically ratified by the U.S. Supreme Court in a couple of decisions, Bakke and Weber, saying that it is okay to take race into account when you're establishing benefits and burdens. So based on...
Could you describe what you mean by race at the time? I believe President Biden recently added people from North Africa, Middle Eastern. At what point, when it began, were you just talking about black? Were we talking about Hispanic? Were we talking about Asian? At what time were these different groups added, and at what time were women added to the mix?
So the women were added a few years after the original affirmative action order was issued, but then in the 1970s, the OMB came up with this Directive 15, which establishes racial categories that we actually live with today, which broadly defines Asian, but irrationally also defines Asian to exclude many people who are from Asia. For example, someone from Afghanistan is not considered Asian under the federal law. Someone from the Middle East is not considered Asian. People from North Africa are considered white. People from different parts of the world are labeled other things. Hispanics are people who only derive from Spanish-speaking countries. So
if I'm say of German descent, but my ancestors spent a few generations in Uruguay, am I considered Hispanic or am I considered European?
These are difficult questions, and I think right now you would be considered South American or Latino or Hispanic, depending on which federal law you're actually looking at. A lot of these federal laws contradict each other into who's in and who's out.
Right. If I'm 1/4 Mexican and 3/4 Irish or something in ancestry, and by Mexican I mean
Hispanic.
Even not Hispanic, because Hispanic, as you just mentioned, covers people of European descent who came here from Cuba, say. Could you, if I'm 1/4, like I said, if I'm 1/4 of my ancestry is from Uruguay and 3/4 is from Ireland, am I considered a minority for purposes of this law?
It is presently interpreted as self-identification. So if you identify as that race, you get the benefits under the current federal laws. So it's not a blood quantum sort of process that they go through. They ask you how you identify.
You talk about people who are at a disadvantage. If my father's a billionaire, but my ancestry is Latin American, am I considered disadvantaged?
Yes, at one interesting point, we just won a case against the Minority Business Development Agency, and the judge in that case said that under federal law, Oprah Winfrey is disadvantaged.
Right, so is there any reason for this other than that you want to divide Americans? Why we don't take in, if we're really looking at disadvantage, I can have a life of hell, but since my ancestors are from Europe, I'm not disadvantaged. And you know what I mean?
We can decide who is disadvantaged in this country by asking them. Under Medicaid, you can get on the Medicaid rolls by establishing your individual need. There's no reason to assume someone is disadvantaged just by the color of their skin, which is what federal law does in many, many programs right now.
Okay. I'll maybe come back to myself later. Mr. Krishnamurthy?